It's great to see federal members standing up as real politicians, doing what they've pledged to do, and support the Australian people. So put it together. He's come all the way from Dandenong today. Federal ALP member for Bruce, Julian L.
G'day. G'day Kevin. I've seen you for a few years. Can I acknowledge the traditional owners, the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present. Thank you for that speech and welcome to country, and to any other elders who may be here with us. I wanted to state a few contentions up front very clearly. The persecution and treatment of Julian Assange are unconscionable. He is an Australian citizen with the same rights as you or me. And our government, the Australian government's failure to speak out against extradition to the United States and demand his return is shameful. We should say that clearly. Now, we hear a lot from ministers, weasel words about our legal process and will have his day in court. But true to form, the most offensive, the wrongest, the most immoral words came from the Prime Minister, who said Julian Assange should face the music, as if this was some ordinary case. And I'd say right at the outset, it is not an ordinary case. It is fundamentally and inherently political. And unlawful, they say. It corrupts and risks what public support exists. And I'll say this at the outset for the US-Australia alliance, when our government is too scared and too cowed to defend one of our own citizens. It corrupts our democracy when our government refuses to fight to defend Australian citizens just because they don't agree with their political philosophy. And most importantly, perhaps, and I'll get to this, the precedent that extradition would set would dangerously undermine our sovereignty and have a chilling effect on journalism and the media's ability in this country to hold power to account. Now, I applaud everyone who's taken the time to come here tonight to stand up and to speak up, giving voice to our values. The very act of doing so pushes back and actually strengthens our democracy, I believe. I'm a protester from way back. And I do stand with you here in my own capacity as a federal Labor member, but as a member of the cross-party parliamentary group fighting to see Julian freed and returned home, and also, importantly, to change public opinion. Because we know we've seen an incredible propaganda war for almost a decade now to brainwash people and obscure the truth. And I never thought, to tell you the truth, when I got elected to Parliament, that I'd find myself in a little club with Barnaby Joyce and George Christensen. But there you go, the meetings are always fun. But we do need to be very clear-eyed, and this is important, about what extradition to the United States would mean. It'd mean one of our citizens, one of us, would face an effective death sentence. The current charges would see Julian condemned for 175 years in extreme isolation in the US. And indeed, in the state of Virginia, they have the death penalty. There's nothing to say that he would not face the death penalty. And Australia proudly has a long history of opposing extradition to countries that have the death penalty. Now, that alone, in my view, should be enough for our government to speak up and to push back. But then there's the torture that's been inflicted on him in the UK. It's not a phrase you often hear, is it, about an Australian, the torture that has been inflicted on him in the United Kingdom. And it should not be said lightly and must never become acceptable. But the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Neil Melzer, investigated his case, and I'll read two quick quotes. He said all the symptoms for prolonged exposure to psychological torture were shown, and his health condition was so dire that his very life was now at risk. Now, other speakers will talk about the health impacts, but I do say that when the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture says that one of our citizens has been tortured, the Australian government must demand that he board home. They must speak up, they must speak out, and they must bring him home. You can't say this is normal or acceptable. You can't just kick it off at a press conference and say next question. Now, it doesn't matter, and this is important, it doesn't matter whether you agree with him, it doesn't matter whether you like him, it doesn't matter whether you dislike him. He's an Australian and he's entitled to the protection of our government. But even beyond the individual justice, if the death penalty and the torture aren't enough to spur our government to action, there are broader, deeper principles perhaps at stake, because there is much more to this inherently political case. He's been persecuted by the most powerful governments in the world for a decade, because he needs to be punished for exposing their war crimes and misuse of state power. That's his real crime. That's what they're really going after him for. To silence him in the WikiLeaks project and to scare others into silence, the chilling effect, and that is incredibly serious. Now I know I may not be in a majority here, that I don't personally agree with everything he's said or everything he's done. I've read a couple of his books, I found them challenging many years ago, and I did not agree with a lot of them. I did agree with some of them. But that's not the point. Agreeing with him is not the point. It is not, it cannot, and must not ever be the point in a democracy if we're to protect our democratic values. Now the case does go to the importance of journalism and journalists in a democracy holding power to account. Publishing embarrassing classified footage of the Iraq War is journalistic behaviour, supposedly protected by the First Amendment to the US Constitution. And I'll quote Kevin Rudd. If the case is essentially that Julian Assange broke the law by obtaining and disclosing secret information, then I struggle to see what separates him from any journalist who solicits, obtains and publishes such information. Now one of the other, go Kevin, who knew? One of the other claims is that he's not a journalist, and that is irrelevant. Again, it's not the point, it's a distraction. The protections under the law apply to journalistic activities, not a special magical class of people. They could apply to me, they could apply to you if you engage in such publishing activities. And what he published is no different in principle to the Pentagon Papers in 1971 that exposed similar misadventures during the Vietnam War and excesses of power by two United States presidents. And that was upheld by the US Supreme Court. So the chilling effect that this case would have on so-called mainstream media is profound. The pursuit is deliberate and it's calculated to mute whistleblowing and shut down investigative journalism to the military and this kind of power. And if he's guilty of serious crime for publishing classified material for war crimes, then our very democracies are weakened. Media will be too scared to publish in the future. Now one thing, and this is kind of a nerdy point, but the more you look into us, this is one of the most important things that I believe Australians have to understand, which is this dangerous principle in this case of extraterritoriality, which is getting lost in the propaganda. But we should be very clear, Australians should be very, very clear. If this American bid succeeds, the precedent is frightening. Because whatever he did in 2010-11, it's not espionage. There's no evidence he attempted to hack into US government computers. There's no evidence that he coerced or got someone else to try and do so. There's also no evidence that lives were lost or serious harm done. But the point is, he's not a US citizen, and the actions that he took place outside the United States. The publication of material took place outside the United States. But if under this precedent that would be set if he is extradited and they get the video images they want of him shuffling around in leg shackles in a US prison, then what that means is anyone who publishes anything that offends the US state and the US government could then be prosecuted anywhere in the world under the US Espionage Act, including journalists in Australia or any Australian. And our government should defend our sovereignty and these freedoms. And look, the final substantive sort of scene-setting point, if you like, we've got a lot of speakers focusing on particular issues, and I'm trying to give perhaps an overview. But it is the sexual assault allegations and the conflicting and often sensational, salacious reporting for many years. Allegations of sexual assault and rape are incredibly serious matters that should not be weaponised or misused for political purposes. Now, you read a lot of articles and you're left confused, what do I believe? Well, that media confusion, in my view, is deliberate. Julian Assange shone light on power and exposed corruption. And suddenly and skillfully, this bright light has turned back to shine on him. This is not an accident. He's a hacker. He's a narcissist. He's a spy. He doesn't shower. He doesn't look after his cat properly, you know. And then all of a sudden, he's a creepy predator. Citizens must not suspend their critical thinking and analytical brain when these kind of allegations are made. I'd encourage people who wonder about the truth of these to read the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture's case review. He makes clear, and these are not my contentions, these are his. Dangerous stuff for a politician to talk about this issue, so I'll stick to his contentions. He was subjected to a preliminary investigation for 9 years with no charges. The police tampered and rewrote evidence to manufacture these accusations. Julian Assange did not run away from interview by the Swedish authorities. He actually went to the authorities and the police several times when in Sweden. He was given permission by the authorities to leave the country. It was when he was in London that he heard of secret proceedings in the United States to extradite him. And yet still he offered repeatedly to return to Sweden, provided an assurance was given that he would not then be extradited to the United States. He offered to give evidence over many years from asylum in person, by video link. But the objective, of course, was not to investigate in a real way. It wasn't to keep the investigation alive. It was to keep it in suspended animation for 9 years without ever laying a charge. But of course, magically then, the case was dropped when he was in British custody and able to face extradition. Remember, that's not my analysis. That's a UN Special Rapporteur on torture. And so despite all of this, despite the effective death sentence, the torture, the obvious manifest injustice, our government refuses to speak up for this Australian. Ministers hide behind their weasel words, and I'll say again, it doesn't matter whether you agree with him or like him or dislike him. He's an Australian. He has the same rights as all of us. He's entitled to the protection of our government, and he deserves our support. And so I've used a lot of words, but I might just finish with that lovely phrase that I heard Andrew Wilkie and George Christensen use this week in London. They said aptly, "He's our rat bag and we must bring him home." So again, I thank you. There are many federal parliamentarians who stand with you, who do speak up, and I encourage you to continue your fight and to keep speaking up, and also, as you said, go and fill out a postcard and cheer him up. Thank you very much.
Keep putting it together. Federal MP for Bruce, Julian Hill. Mr. Julian.